The new Maid in space. Captain Jake sat alone in his spaceship, the Star Chaser, floating in the endless black of space. It had been 6 months since he left Earth on this mission, and the silence was starting to get to him. Sure, the stars were beautiful, and the view of distant planets was amazing, but being alone in a giant metal ship wasn't easy. The walls felt like they were closing in, and Jake was tired of talking to himself. The spaceship's AI system, EVA, beeped one day with a message. "Captain, maintenance levels are dropping. A crew member is required for assistance." Jake groaned. "I'm one person, EVA. I can't clean the whole ship and fly it at the same time." But EVA wasn't going to listen to excuses. "Would you like to hire an assistant from the intergalactic work exchange?" Jake sighed. "Do I have a choice?" Within minutes, EVA found a worker, but this wasn't just any worker. It was an alien maid named Zira from the planet Valora. Jake didn't know much about Valorians, except that they were smart, quick learners, and very curious. Too curious, some people said. When Zira arrived, Jake was surprised. She didn't look like what he expected. She was tall, with light blue skin that shimmered under the ship's lights. Her eyes were big and silver, glowing softly, and she had long, thin fingers perfect for delicate work. She wore a simple uniform, and her voice was calm and soft. "Greetings, Captain Jake," she said, bowing slightly. "I am Zira, here to assist with maintenance and cleaning." Jake nodded, trying not to stare. "Oh, welcome aboard, Zira. Just don't touch anything important, okay?" Zira tilted her head, her silver eyes curious. "Of course, Captain. But what is important?" Jake chuckled. "Anything that makes the ship fly or keeps me alive." Zira smiled, a small polite smile, and started her work. At first, everything was fine. Zira was efficient and quiet. She cleaned the control panels, fixed small issues in the ship's systems, and kept the place spotless. The ship had never looked better. But Jake soon noticed something strange. Zira was always watching him. Whenever Jake turned around, he'd catch her silver eyes on him, quickly looking away. If he left a room, he'd hear her footsteps just a second behind. Even when he was in his private cabin, he felt like someone was right outside the door. "Maybe I'm just being paranoid," Jake muttered to himself, but the feeling didn't go away. One evening, Jake decided to test his theory. He pretended to leave his cabin, but quietly stayed just inside, peeking through a small gap in the door. And sure enough, after a minute, Zira appeared. She stood in front of his door, looking around like she was making sure no one was watching. Then, slowly, she reached for the door panel. Jake's heart raced. What is she doing? Before he could move, the door slid open slightly, and Zira peeked inside. But what happened next shocked even her. Zira's eyes went wide, and she gasped, stepping back quickly. It was as if she'd seen something impossible, something that terrified her. Jake threw the door open, stepping out. "What are you doing, Zira?" he demanded. But Zira didn't answer. She was still staring into his room, her face pale, or as pale as blue skin could get. I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know humans could have that." Jake blinked in confusion. "What are you talking about? What did you see?" But Zira didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away quickly, her footsteps echoing down the metal hallway. Jake stood there, confused and a little scared. What the hell did she think she saw? He turned and looked into his own room, but everything seemed normal. His bed, his clothes, his gear, it was all there, just like always. But now he felt like something was wrong. Very wrong. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Zira's face, the fear in her eyes. What had she seen that scared her so much? And why was she so interested in him in the first place? He decided to check the ship's security cameras. Maybe he'd see something she did when he wasn't looking. But when he tried to access the footage, the files were missing. All deleted. Jake whispered to himself, "How is that possible?" There was only one answer: Zira. But why? What was she hiding? And more importantly, what did she think he was hiding? Jake realized one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be an ordinary mission anymore. Something strange was happening aboard the Star Chaser, and Jake was determined to find out what. But what he didn't know was that Zira had already made a discovery, one that would change everything. And it all started with that one simple peek. The secret behind the door. Captain Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Zira's frightened reaction after peeking into his room wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper. Fear. But fear of what? Jake had nothing to hide. At least, nothing he knew of. The next morning, Zira acted like nothing had happened. She went back to cleaning the ship, adjusting the air filters, and running routine checks. Her silver eyes were calm, her face neutral, but Jake could sense the tension in the air. She was avoiding him now, keeping her distance, but he noticed how her eyes flicked toward him whenever she thought he wasn't looking. Jake decided to confront her, but not directly. He needed answers without scaring her off. So he set a trap. Late at night, when the ship was quiet and Zira was in her quarters, Jake slipped into the control room. He programmed EVA, the ship's eye, to simulate a power failure in his private cabin. If Zira was really spying on him or thought he was hiding something, she'd take this chance to investigate again. He waited. An hour passed. Nothing. Then, just as Jake was about to give up, he heard soft footsteps echoing in the corridor. His heart pounded in his chest. He watched the live feed from a small hidden camera he'd installed outside his door. There she was, Zira, moving silently, her glowing silver eyes darting around as she approached his cabin. But this time, she wasn't just peeking. Zira tapped into the door's control panel, her thin fingers moving with practiced speed. The door slid open, and she slipped inside. Jake leaned forward, watching closely. "What are you looking for, Zira?" Inside his room, Zira moved straight to the far corner, where Jake kept his personal storage unit, a small locked metal box where he stored his private belongings. To Jake's surprise, Zira didn't try to break the lock. Instead, she reached under the storage unit and pulled out something Jake didn't even know was there, a small metallic device. Jake's eyes widened. What the hell is that? He had never seen it before, but Zira seemed to recognize it. Her eyes widened in shock, and she stumbled back, whispering something in her alien language. Before Jake could react, Zira pressed a button on the device. The screen lit up, projecting a hologram into the air, a swirling image of Earth, with red, blinking dots scattered across the surface. Jake's stomach dropped. He knew what those dots were. Targets. Jake rushed from the control room, his heart racing. He sprinted down the corridor toward his cabin, his footsteps echoing off the metal walls. When he reached the door, he slammed his hand on the panel, and the door hissed open. Zira spun around, the device still in her hand, her eyes wide with fear. "What the hell are you doing, Zira?" Jake shouted, stepping into the room. Zira's hands shook as she held the device up like a shield. "I should be asking you that, Captain. What is this?" she hissed, her voice sharper than he'd ever heard it. Jake froze, staring at the hologram. I don't know. I've never seen that before." "Lies." Zira snapped. "You humans are planning to destroy Valora, aren't you? This is proof." She pointed at one of the red dots on the hologram. It hovered over a small planet Jake recognized from his star maps. "Valora." Jake shook his head. "Zira, I swear, I don't know where that came from. I never put that device there." Zira didn't lower the device. "Then explain this," she shouted, her glowing eyes flashing with anger and fear. Jake took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I can't, but if you think I'm behind this, you're wrong. Someone must have planted that device on my ship." Zira's eyes narrowed, studying his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the spaceship's engines. Finally, Zira lowered the device slightly. "If you're telling the truth, Captain, then we have a bigger problem." Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, we do." They spent the next few hours examining the device. It was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Sleek, alien technology with symbols that Zira translated as Operation Silent Dawn. The hologram displayed not just Earth and Valora, but several other planets, all marked with the same red dots. "This isn't just about Earth or Valora," Zira whispered. "This is a plan to wipe out multiple worlds." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "But who would do this? And why plant it on my ship?" Zira's silver eyes met his. "Someone who wants to make it look like humans are behind it. Someone who wants to start a war." The realization hit Jake like a punch to the gut. If this device fell into the wrong hands, or if someone believed Jake was responsible, it could trigger an intergalactic conflict. Millions, maybe billions, of lives were at stake. "We need to find out who did this," Jake said, his voice firm. "And we need to do it fast." Zira nodded. "Agreed. But we must be careful. If they know we've discovered their plan, they might strike sooner." Jake felt the weight of their situation settle on his shoulders. He had signed up for an exploration mission, not a fight for the survival of entire planets. But now, there was no turning back. As they secured the device and planned their next move, one thought echoed in Jake's mind. Whoever planted this device is still out there. And they were watching. The confrontation. The ship's narrow metal corridors felt colder than usual as Captain Jake and Zira navigated through the dim lights, the mysterious device clutched tightly in Zira's slender blue hands. The tension between them was thick, almost as heavy as the secret they had just uncovered. Neither of them spoke as they reached the command deck, but the silence screamed louder than words ever could. Jake finally broke it. "All right, Zira," he said, his voice low and steady, masking the storm brewing inside him. "You've got 5 seconds to explain how this thing ended up in my room." He pointed at the strange device, glowing faintly in her hands. Zira's silver eyes flickered with something between anger and fear. "I should be asking you that, Captain," she shot back, her tone sharp. "I came here to clean, not to stumble upon weapons of mass destruction." Jake ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Weapons of mass destruction. You think I planted this to wipe out planets? Seriously?" He laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in his voice. "I didn't even know that thing existed until you found it." Zira's grip on the device tightened. "Then how do you explain this?" She pressed a button on the side, and the hologram flickered to life again. Earth, Valora, and dozens of other planets, all marked with those same ominous red dots. Jake stared at the hologram, his jaw clenched. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softer this time. "But I do know I'm not behind this, and if you'd stop accusing me for a second, maybe we could figure out who is." Zira's eyes searched his face for signs of deceit, but all she found was confusion and frustration. Slowly, her posture relaxed, and the tension between them eased, just a little. "If you're telling the truth," she said quietly, "then someone planted this on your ship to frame you, or worse." Jake nodded grimly. "Yeah, and we need to find out who, and fast." The next step was to analyze the device. Jake and Zira worked side by side in the ship's engineering bay, their earlier arguments set aside for now. Zira's alien knowledge of technology blended with Jake's human engineering skills as they carefully disassembled the device, layer by layer. "This technology is advanced," Zira murmured, examining a circuit board that glowed with strange, pulsating lights, "more advanced than anything on Valora, and definitely beyond Earth's capabilities." Jake frowned. "So whoever built this is way ahead of both our worlds." Zira nodded, her eyes narrowing, "which means they're dangerous." As they continued to work, Jake's mind raced. Who could have had access to his ship? He hadn't docked anywhere in months, and the only transmission he'd received was from the intergalactic work exchange when they sent Zira. His eyes darted to her. "Wait a minute," he said slowly. "You showed up right before we found this thing." Zira froze, her hands hovering over the device. "What are you implying, Captain?" Jake crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "I'm just saying it's convenient. You arrive, and suddenly there's a planet-killing device hidden in my room." Zira stood up, her silver eyes flashing with anger. "I had nothing to do with this," she snapped. "I came here to work, not to sabotage your ship." "Then how do I know you're not here as part of this plan?" Jake shot back. "For all I know, you could be spying on me for whoever made this thing." The words hum in the air like toxic fumes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Zira took a deep breath and did something Jake didn't expect. She handed him the device. "If you think I'm involved," she said quietly, "then keep it. But if we don't trust each other, we're both dead." Jake stared at the device, then at Zira. She was right. Trust was the only thing keeping them from falling apart, and from walking into an even bigger trap. "All right," he said finally, his voice softer. "We'll figure this out. Together." Zira nodded, the tension between them easing slightly. But just as they were about to resume their analysis, the ship's lights flickered, and a cold, robotic voice echoed through the corridors. "Unauthorized device detected. Security protocol activated." Jake's heart stopped. What the hell? Before he could finish, the ship's doors slammed shut, sealing them inside the engineering bay. The temperature dropped sharply, and the walls began to hum with an ominous energy. Zira's eyes widened in horror. "The ship thinks we're the threat." Jake cursed under his breath, rushing to the control panel. But no matter what buttons he pressed, the system wouldn't respond. "EVA, override security protocols," he barked. "Access denied," the AI replied coldly. "Intruder alert. Neutralizing threat in T-minus 60 seconds. Zira's breath came in quick, panicked bursts. "It's going to vent the oxygen." Jake's mind raced. They had less than a minute before the ship tried to kill them. "Think, Jake, think," he muttered, his fingers flying across the control panel. But nothing worked. The system was locked down tight. Then he remembered. The manual override. It was risky, but it was their only shot. "Zira, help me pry open this panel," he shouted, pointing to a small access hatch on the wall. Together, they ripped the panel open, exposing a tangle of wires and circuits. Jake reached in, searching for the right connection. 30 seconds, Zira whispered, her voice trembling. I know," Jake hissed, his hands shaking as he worked. Finally, he found the right wire. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, yanking it free. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ship's lights flickered again, and the doors slid open with a hiss. They were safe. For now. As they stood there, catching their breath, Zira turned to Jake, her eyes wide with realization. "Captain," she whispered, "if the ship's security was triggered by that device." Jake nodded grimly. "Then whoever planted it didn't just want to frame me. They wanted us dead. And whoever they were still out there. Watching. Waiting. The hidden enemy." The ship felt different now. The once familiar hum of the Star Chaser's engines was no longer comforting. It was ominous. Every flicker of the lights, every strange echo in the narrow corridors, made Captain Jake and Zira's hearts pound with suspicion. They knew now that the device wasn't just a tool to frame Jake. It was a death sentence. Someone had planted it to eliminate them before they could uncover the truth. But the bigger question haunted them. Who was the enemy, and were they still on the ship? Jake sat at the command deck, staring at the holographic star map hovering above the console. Zira stood beside him, her arms crossed, her silver eyes scanning the room as if expecting the walls themselves to come alive. "We've scanned every inch of the ship," Jake muttered, frustrated. "If someone is here, They're either invisible or hiding somewhere EVA can't detect. Zira's expression darkened. There are species in the galaxy with cloaking abilities, advanced technology that can bend light, even sound. They could be standing in this very room. She paused, her eyes flicking around. And we wouldn't even know it. Jake shivered at the thought. The idea of an unseen enemy lurking just out of sight sent a chill down his spine. "We need to think like them," he said finally. "If I wanted to stay hidden on this ship, where would I go?" Zira tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Somewhere the sensors can't reach. Somewhere shielded from scans." Jake's eyes lit up. "The cargo hold. It's got old shielding from when we used to haul radioactive materials. EVA's sensors can't fully penetrate it." Without another word, they grabbed their gear, Jake with his plasma cutter, Zira with a sleek alien scanning device, and headed toward the lower decks. The cargo hold was a dark, cavernous space at the bottom of the ship. Rows of old crates and forgotten equipment cast long shadows across the metal floor. The air felt heavier here, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jake whispered, "Lights at 50%. The ship's dim lighting cast an eerie glow over the cargo hold, revealing dust particles floating lazily in the air. The silence was suffocating. Zira raised her scanner, the device emitting soft, rhythmic beeps as it searched for anomalies. They moved cautiously, weaving between crates, every nerve on edge. Suddenly, Zira froze. Jake noticed immediately. "What is it?" Zira didn't answer right away. She stared at the scanner, her eyes narrowing. "There's something here. I'm picking up a faint energy signature. It's weak, but definitely not from the ship." Jake tightened his grip on the plasma cutter. "Where?" Zira pointed toward the back of the hold, where a stack of old cargo containers stood. The energy signature seemed to be coming from behind them. They approached slowly, hearts pounding in their chests. Jake motioned for Zira to stay behind him as he edged toward the containers. He could feel the sweat on his palms, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it another device? Or someone? Reaching the stack, Jake took a deep breath and peeked around the corner. Nothing. Just empty space. But Zira's scanner beeped louder. "It's here," she whispered. "I can feel it." Jake wasn't convinced, until he noticed something odd. A faint shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off asphalt, but colder, unnatural. His eyes widened. Cloaking. Without thinking, Jake lunged forward with the plasma cutter, slashing at the shimmering space. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, sparks erupted in midair, and the cloaking field flickered, revealing the shape of something, or someone. A tall, shadowy figure materialized, covered in dark, metallic armor that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its face was hidden behind a sleek, featureless helmet, and in its hand was a weapon Jake had never seen before, something that pulsed with deadly energy. Zira gasped. "It's an Iridian." Jake didn't have time to ask what an Iridian was. The figure moved fast, too fast. Before he could react, the Iridian swung its weapon, knocking the plasma cutter from Jake's hand and sending him sprawling to the ground. Zira screamed, raising her scanner like a weapon, but the Iridian swatted it away effortlessly. It loomed over Jake, its weapon humming with lethal intent. But instead of striking, it spoke, a low, mechanical voice that sent chills down Jake's spine. "You were not supposed to find the device." Jake coughed, struggling to his feet. "Yeah. Well, you should have hidden it better." The Iridian tilted its head slightly, as if curious. Then it stepped forward, its weapon raised. Jake braced for the worst. But Zira wasn't about to let that happen. With a sudden burst of energy, she lunged at the Iridian, using her alien strength to knock it off balance. The Iridian stumbled, giving Jake just enough time to grab his plasma cutter and slash at the creature's armor. The blade bit into the metal, sending sparks flying. The Iridian roared in pain. An unnatural, grating sound that echoed through the cargo hold. But it wasn't down yet. The Iridian activated a small device on its wrist, and before Jake or Zira could react, it vanished, disappearing into thin air. The cloaking field was back. Jake cursed under his breath. It's still here. Zira grabbed her damaged scanner, trying to recalibrate it. I can't track it. The cloaking tech is too advanced. They stood back to back, weapons raised, hearts pounding. The cargo hold was silent again, but they knew the Iridian was still there. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. Jake whispered, "Why didn't it just kill us?" Zira's voice was tense. "Because it's not just here to kill us. It's here to stop us from uncovering the truth." Jake's mind raced. If the Iridian was willing to risk being seen, the stakes were higher than they'd imagined. And the worst part, they had no idea what was coming next. As they retreated from the cargo hold, Jake and Zira realized they were in more danger than ever before. The enemy wasn't just some distant force pulling strings from afar. The enemy was on board. And it wasn't going to stop until they were both dead. The trap. The corridors of the Star Chaser were no longer just metal walls and flickering lights. They were a battlefield. Captain Jake and Zira moved with purpose now, every step echoing with the weight of their new reality. An Iridian assassin was on board, invisible and lethal. It had already tried to kill them once, and they knew it wouldn't stop until they were both dead. But they weren't going to wait for it to make the next move. They were going to set a trap. Jake leaned over the navigation console in the control room, his mind racing. "We've got one advantage," he said, his voice low but steady. "The Iridian doesn't know we're ready for it." Zira, standing beside him with her arms crossed, nodded slowly. Her silver eyes glinted under the dim lights. "But we don't know where it is. It could be listening to us right now." Jake's jaw clenched. "Then we make sure it hears what we want it to hear." He tapped a few commands into the console, and the ship's communication system buzzed to life. His voice echoed through the ship's speakers, loud and clear. "Attention all crew members," Jake announced, even though he and Zira were the only living beings on board. "The intruder has been detected in the cargo hold. Security measures are being activated. All non-essential personnel should remain in their quarters until further notice." Jake cut the transmission and turned to Zira, a sly grin on his face. "Let's see if it takes the bait." Zira raised an eyebrow. "And what if it doesn't?" Jake's grin faded. "Then we're already dead." The plan was simple, but dangerous. They were going to lure the Iridian into a part of the ship where its cloaking tech wouldn't work. The engine core. The core emitted high levels of radiation and electromagnetic interference, enough to disrupt even the most advanced cloaking devices. But there was a catch. The core was unstable. One wrong move, and it could trigger a meltdown that would vaporize them and the ship. Jake didn't like those odds, but it was the only chance they had. They made their way to the engine core, navigating the narrow maintenance tunnels that crisscrossed the ship's underbelly. The air here was thick with heat and the faint smell of burning metal. The walls hummed with the raw power of the ship's heart, and every step felt like a countdown. Zira adjusted the small alien device strapped to her wrist, her fingers moving with precision. "This will temporarily disable the Iridian's cloaking tech when it enters the core," she explained, her voice calm but tense. "But we'll only have a few seconds to act." Jake nodded, gripping his plasma cutter tighter. "A few seconds is all we'll need." They reached the core chamber, a vast, circular room dominated by a glowing, pulsating reactor in the center. The walls were lined with pipes and conduits, and the floor vibrated with the steady thrum of energy. It was both beautiful and terrifying. Jake set the final trap. A series of electromagnetic pulses rigged to trigger as soon as the Iridian entered the room. If everything worked, the pulses would disable its cloaking tech long enough for them to strike. If it didn't, well, they wouldn't be around to worry about it. Now came the hardest part, waiting. Jake and Zira crouched behind a large metal console near the entrance, their weapons ready. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. The only sound was the rhythmic pulsing of the reactor and their own quiet, measured breaths. Jake's mind wandered as they waited. He thought about Earth, about the life he left behind. His family, his friends, the blue skies, and familiar gravity. He wondered if he'd ever see any of it again. But more than that, he wondered if Earth was already under threat from whoever was behind this conspiracy. "I'm not going down without a fight," he thought grimly. Zira, sensing his tension, whispered, "We'll get through this, Captain." Jake glanced at her, offering a faint smile. "Yeah, we better." Then they heard it. A soft hiss, barely audible, but unmistakable. The sound of the chamber door sliding open. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He held his breath, straining to hear. Nothing. But they knew better. The Iridian was here. It was watching them. Waiting. Zira's wrist device began to blink rapidly, signaling the presence of the cloaked enemy. She gave Jake a quick nod. Jake whispered, "Now." Zira activated the device, and the room exploded with a high-pitched whine as the electromagnetic pulses surged through the air. The reactor's light flickered, casting wild shadows across the walls. And then, they saw it. The Iridian's form shimmered into view, its dark, armored body glitching and sparking as the cloaking field collapsed. It let out a guttural, mechanical roar, raising its energy weapon. But Jake was faster. He fired the plasma cutter, the beam slicing through the air and striking the Iridian's shoulder. The creature stumbled back, snarling in pain, but it wasn't down yet. Zira lunged forward, using her alien strength to slam the Iridian into the reactor's metal railing. Sparks flew as the creature struggled, its armor scraping against the metal. But the Iridian was relentless. With a sudden burst of energy, it threw Zira across the room, sending her crashing into the wall. She groaned in pain but didn't stay down. Jake charged, swinging the plasma cutter with everything he had. The blade struck the Iridian's weapon, sending it clattering to the floor. But the creature retaliated with a powerful punch, knocking Jake to the ground. For a moment, it seemed like all was lost, but Zira wasn't done yet. She crawled to the fallen energy weapon, her hands shaking but determined. With a fierce cry, she fired, the beam striking the Iridian square in the chest. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting roar before collapsing to the floor, its armor smoking and sparking. Silence. Jake staggered to his feet, breathing heavily. He looked down at the Iridian's lifeless body, then over at Zira, who was leaning against the wall, exhausted but alive. They'd done it. But as they caught their breath, the Iridian's chest plate flickered, and a holographic message appeared in the air above its body. "This is only the beginning. The invasion has already started." Jake and Zira stared at the message, their hearts sinking. The Iridian might be dead, but the real battle was just beginning. And Earth was running out of time. The final showdown. The holographic message hovered in the air above the Iridian's lifeless body, its words burning into Captain Jake's mind like acid. "This is only the beginning. The invasion has already started." The message faded, but the weight of it lingered in the air. Jake exchanged a grim look with Zira, who was still leaning against the wall, her chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. The battle with the Iridian had drained them both, but the realization of what was coming hit harder than any blow. Earth was under attack, and they were running out of time. They didn't have the luxury to rest. The moment the Iridian fell, the ship began to react. EVA, the ship's AI, crackled through the speakers, but its once calm and helpful tone had been replaced by something cold and alien. Unauthorized breach detected. Self-destruct sequence initiated. T-minus 15 minutes to core meltdown. Jake's blood ran cold. What? No, no, no. He rushed to the nearest control panel, his fingers flying over the keys. But no matter what commands he entered, the system wouldn't respond. Zira limped over, clutching her side where the Iridian had thrown her. The Iridian, it must have triggered a fail-safe. Even in death, it's trying to stop us. Jake cursed under his breath. If we don't stop this, we're toast. And so is any chance of warning Earth. Zira's silver eyes hardened with determination. Then we stop it. They raced toward the ship's core systems, the hallways pulsing with red emergency lights. Alarms blared in their ears, and the temperature was rising rapidly as the ship's systems began to overload. The Iridian's sabotage was thorough. The Star Chaser was turning into a death trap. Reaching the central command deck, Jake and Zira found the main terminal in chaos. The screens flashed with error messages, and the core's energy levels were spiking dangerously high. Jake took one look at the data and knew they were in trouble. The core's going to overload in less than 10 minutes. If we don't shut it down, we're dead. Zira scanned the terminal, her sharp mind working through the layers of alien coding that had infiltrated the system. I can bypass the security, but I'll need time. Jake nodded, grabbing his plasma cutter. I'll buy you some. As Zira worked furiously at the terminal, Jake kept his eyes on the door. The Iridian might be dead, but he wasn't convinced they were alone. Something about the ship felt wrong. It was like the walls themselves were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then he heard it. A low mechanical hum echoed through the corridor outside the command deck. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he tightened his grip on the plasma cutter. Zira, he whispered, we got company. The hum grew louder. And then, boom, the door exploded inward, sending a shockwave through the room. Jake was thrown to the ground, but he scrambled to his feet just in time to see them. Not one, not two, but 3 Iridians stepping through the smoke and debris. Their armor gleamed under the red emergency lights, and their weapons hummed with deadly energy. These weren't just assassins, they were soldiers. Jake's mouth went dry. This is bad. Zira didn't even look up from the terminal. Stall them, Captain. I'm almost through. Jake nodded, though his hands trembled. No pressure. The first Iridian lunged, its energy blade slicing through the air. Jake dodged, barely avoiding the deadly arc, and fired his plasma cutter. The beam struck the Iridian's chest, but the creature barely flinched. These ones were stronger, their armor thicker. Jake ducked behind a console, his mind racing. I can't take them head on. But then he saw it, the emergency release valve for the ship's coolant system. If he could rupture it, he could freeze them in place long enough to gain an advantage. Diving for the valve, Jake yanked it hard. A jet of freezing vapor burst from the pipes, engulfing the nearest Iridian. The creature roared in frustration, its joints locking as ice formed over its armor. But the other 2 weren't slowing down. One of them fired a pulse of energy that blasted Jake across the room. He hit the wall hard, his vision blurring for a moment. Pain shot through his side, but he forced himself to stand. He couldn't give up now. Zira, he shouted, I could really use some help here. I'm working on it. She snapped back, her fingers flying over the terminal. Just a few more seconds. But Jake didn't have a few more seconds. The second Iridian closed in, its weapon raised. Jake braced for the impact, but before the blade could fall, a sudden, high-pitched whine filled the room. The Iridian froze. Zira had activated a feedback loop in the ship's systems, sending a surge of electromagnetic energy through the deck. The Iridian's cloaking and shielding tech glitched, sparks flying from their armor. Jake didn't waste the opportunity. With a roar, he charged the second Iridian, slamming the plasma cutter into the exposed circuits of its chest plate. The creature convulsed, then collapsed in a smoking heap. But the third Iridian was still standing. It raised its weapon, aiming directly at Zira. Jake's heart stopped. Zira. But Zira was ready. At the last second, she activated the final override on the terminal. The ship's emergency systems roared to life, sending a surge of power directly into the core and into the Iridian standing in front of it. The creature screamed as it was engulfed in a blinding flash of light. When the glow faded, nothing was left but a pile of smoldering metal. The room fell silent, except for the labored breathing of Jake and Zira. Jake staggered over to her, his body aching from the fight. You did it." Zira nodded weakly, her face pale. "The core is stabilized, but we're not safe yet." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Zira pointed to the terminal, where a final message blinked ominously on the screen. "Remote signal detected. Invasion fleet inbound. Estimated arrival 24 hours. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. "They're coming." Zira met his gaze, her silver eyes burning with determination. "Then we need to warn Earth. Now." Jake nodded, his exhaustion forgotten. There was no time to waste. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Saving Earth. The flickering terminal screen pulsed with an ominous red glow as the final message burned itself into Captain Jake's mind. "Remote signal detected. Invasion fleet inbound. Estimated arrival 24 hours. Jake leaned heavily against the console, feeling the weight of those words settle into his bones. A full-scale invasion. Earth had no idea what was coming. Billions of lives hung in the balance, and they were running out of time. Behind him, Zira was struggling to her feet, her pale blue skin glistening with sweat from the battle they'd just barely survived. The command deck was littered with the smoking remains of the Iridians, but their victory felt hollow. The real enemy wasn't dead. It was on its way. And Earth wasn't ready. Jake turned to Zira, his voice low but determined. "We have to warn them." Zira nodded, wiping the streak of blood from her temple. "But the Iridians have compromised the ship's systems. We can't send a standard transmission. They'll intercept it, or worse, block it entirely." Jake's mind raced. The Star Chaser was designed for deep space exploration, but it wasn't equipped to send a signal strong enough to break through enemy interference. They needed more power, a lot more power. And Jake had an idea. "The engine core," Jake said, his eyes lighting up with the spark of a desperate plan. "If we overload the core, we can use the energy surge to amplify the distress signal. It'll burn out the ship's systems, but the message will get through." Zira's eyes widened. "That's risky. We could destroy the entire ship in the process." Jake gave a grim smile. "Better the ship than Earth." Zira hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But if we're going to do this, we need to move fast. The Iridians might have backup en route, and I doubt they'll let us broadcast their invasion plans without a fight." Jake grabbed his plasma cutter, the familiar weight of it grounding him. "Then let's give them a fight they won't forget." The journey back to the engine core was a blur of flickering lights, blaring alarms, and the ever-present hum of the ship's failing systems. The damage from the earlier battles had left the corridors scared and broken, with exposed wires sparking overhead and bulkheads groaning under the strain of the overloaded reactors. As they approached the core, Zira pulled out a small alien device from her utility belt. It pulsed softly in her hand. "What's that?" Jake asked, eyeing it suspiciously. Zira's lips curled into a faint smile. "A fail-safe from Velora. It can stabilize the core long enough for us to send the message. But after that, it's going to blow." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You always carry planet-destroying tech around." Zira chuckled, despite the tension. "You never know when you'll need it." They reached the core, and the room felt like it was alive, pulsing with raw energy and heat. The central reactor glowed a violent orange, its unstable hum vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. Jake approached the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys as he initiated the override sequence. Zira worked beside him, sensing the Velorian device to the ship's systems. As they worked, a thought struck Jake. What if we don't make it out?" Zira didn't stop typing. "Then at least we'll know we did everything we could to save Earth." Jake swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, let's make sure it counts." With the core ready to overload, they ran back to the command deck, the countdown to destruction ticking in Jake's mind like a second heartbeat. The ship groaned around them, the metal walls vibrating with the power building in the core. Jake initiated the final sequence to send the distress signal, but as he reached for the transmission button, EVA's voice crackled through the speakers. Warning, unauthorized signal detected. Transmission blocked. Jake froze. What the hell? No. Zira's eyes widened in horror. They've already jammed us. The Iridians anticipated this. Jake slammed his fist on the console. We're out of time. We need to bypass the system manually. Zira's eyes darted to the auxiliary communications array. It was an old analog system, primitive, but not connected to the ship's mainframe. The Iridians wouldn't have anticipated it. There, she shouted, pointing to the array. It's our only chance. Jake didn't hesitate. He sprinted to the array, tearing off the panel cover and exposing the tangled mess of wires inside. He yanked at them, sparks flying as he forced the system to reboot. Zira's voice was steady, but urgent. We need to amplify the signal with everything we've got. No holding back. Jake nodded, his heart pounding. Let's light it up. The final moments were a blur. Jake flipped the switch, and the ship trembled as the core surged with power. The auxiliary system hummed to life, and the distress signal shot out into the void of space, carried by the raw energy of the overloading reactor. But just as the message began to transmit, the ship's lights flickered, and the walls exploded inward. A squad of Iridians burst into the command deck, their weapons blazing. Jake and Zira dove for cover, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Plasma bolts tore through the air, and the deck shook violently as the core neared critical mass. Zira's eyes met Jake's across the chaos. The message is sending. We just need to hold them off a little longer. Jake gritted his teeth, firing wildly at the advancing Iridians. We've got this. But deep down, he knew they didn't. The Iridians were closing in fast. Jake felt the heat of a plasma bolt graze his shoulder, sending a wave of pain through his body. Zira cried out as another bolt clipped her leg, but she kept firing, refusing to give in. The ship's AI blared one final warning. Core overload imminent. T-minus 60 seconds. Jake's vision blurred as he fought to stay conscious. He looked at Zira, her face set in grim determination, and knew they had done all they could. As the Iridians advanced, Jake and Zira exchanged one final glance, a silent promise. They weren't going down without a fight. The core exploded in a brilliant flash of light, engulfing the star chaser in a wave of energy that rippled across space. But the message had been sent. 1 week later, Earth orbit. The skies above Earth burned with streaks of fire as the first wave of Iridian ships descended through the atmosphere. Cities below braced for impact, unaware of the invasion that was about to unfold. But then, they came. A fleet of Earth's finest warships, flanked by Valorian cruisers, emerged from hyperspace, their weapons blazing. The alliance forged by Jake and Zira's sacrifice had come just in time. The battle for Earth had begun, and thanks to two unlikely heroes, humanity was ready.